Hello and welcome to episode 2 of the Millennium Pod, a Star Wars podcast by me, Ari, at ari.in.space on TikTok and at the Millennium Pod, all one word, on Instagram. If you are coming here after listening to last week's episode, welcome back. I am so glad that you have joined me once again. And if you are new this week, welcome. I am excited to share my thoughts with you of Star Wars and a galaxy far, far away. Once again, I am by no means pretending to be an expert in Star Wars lore and facts, etc. So please take everything I say with a bit of a grain of salt. It's mostly just my subjective opinions and my thoughts on what we're going to be talking about today. So with that, let's get into the topic of today. This episode is entitled Queen of Broken Hearts, and it's going to focus on Padme Amidala, specifically Revenge of the Sith, and mostly her death and the mystery that surrounds that, and ultimately why I think that the way they wrote her out of the story to get her out of the way for the original trilogy is very cheap and to her character. I refuse to believe that Padmé Amidala, Queen of Naboo, Senator in the Galactic Senate of the Republic, would die because she lost the will to live. Now, I just want to preface this entire podcast really quick here by saying that I in no way am intending to minimize the very real fact that some people in real life do, in fact, unfortunately, lose the will to live, quote unquote, in various ways, whether that be by some form of depression or mental illness, or potentially something like broken heart syndrome, wherein the body reacts to a traumatic event by releasing a ton of hormones which cause some kind of fatal lowering of blood pressure or cardiac arrest. No, that I know that that's a real thing, but I don't think that's what is happened here, and I don't think that's what's portrayed here. You know, had they actually made it out like Padme did have some form of depression or was mentally ill in some capacity, I think that would have been fantastic. Would have been a fantastic narrative to showcase how real mental illness can be. But that's not what they did. That's not at all what they portrayed in the film. And had they actually made it out like she had real broken heart syndrome, then fine. Once again, that's a real thing. That's a real response to traumatic events. But because she was physically fine, there's no way she could have actually had broken heart syndrome. Like, the med droids would have known. And so that's an important distinction, I feel, because they did have the opportunity to create, like I say, this powerful narrative of the importance and the severity, potential severity of some form of mental health, mental illness, but they didn't. And instead, the narrative that they pushed in Revenge of the Sith and her death was she just gave up because, she didn't have a man anymore. And that's what I think is not cool and a cheap way to end her character. So now let's just assume that in the Star Wars universe, a person can just give up on life without having that either internal, external, some type of ailment that is ailing them. Let's just assume that a perfectly healthy person of mind and body, which to me, that's what Padme was, can just give up on life. I don't see any evidence that this is what she would do. Like, we see her and she is resilient throughout the trilogy, not so much in episode 3, but definitely in episode 1 and 2. Especially given the fact that her last words to Obi-Wan are something along the lines of, "There's still good in him. I know there's still good in him," referring to Anakin. And I really have a hard time believing that she would just, knowing that and believing that, because I believe she truly did believe that there was still good in him, that she would just give up and leave. And abandon him, essentially. I really have a hard time seeing that, especially with what we see in her character previously in episodes 1 and 2. I mean, in episode 1, we see that she goes back to Naboo when the Trade Federation is invading. Even though it's not safe for her, she goes back to be there with the people, to fight with the people, and to unite them. And you're telling me that she wouldn't try to be there and fight for Anakin in this instance when he's turning to the dark side? Like, that alone there, that doesn't make sense to me. And then again in episode 2, we see that she makes the decision to go and rescue Obi-Wan from Geonosis. It's not Anakin's decision. She says, "I'm going, so you kind of have to come because you're supposed to be protecting me." And I mean, yes, Obi-Wan was very important to her, but not nearly as important as Anakin. And you're telling me that she wouldn't, once again, have stayed and fought for Anakin? Like, especially given the fact that she definitely believed that there was still light in him. It doesn't make sense that she wouldn't stick around, to try to help him. And another reason that Padme just giving up on life really doesn't make any sense to me, at least, is the fact that she had just had the twins. And she looked at them and she smiled at them. We see her smile at them, and she named them. And then she abandoned them? Like, that alone doesn't make any sense, especially given how much she loved Anakin, because I truly believe that she was very deeply in love with Anakin, so it doesn't make sense that she would then abandon his children. And I mean, Anakin reasons aside, we see throughout the trilogy, not so much in episode 3, but especially in episode 1 and 2, politics are a huge, huge part of her life. And being that public servant who is doing good and making the world better and more peaceful and more just is very, very important to her. And I find it really hard to believe that knowing what she did before she died, knowing that the Republic was crumbling and that maybe the Separatists who they'd been fighting all along were actually not the bad guys potentially, but they still were, knowing all that she did, I find it very hard to believe that she would leave the world to the chaos that was going to ensue. I truly believe that it was her personality that she would have wanted to do whatever she could in whatever capacity to make the world a better place through politics, diplomacy, etc. Like, her beloved republic was crumbling. Something she'd worked for years was crumbling. I just don't see her abandoning that either. Especially when we consider the fact that she actually had her own kids who were going to be growing up in this chaotic world. I find it really hard to believe that she wouldn't have wanted to do whatever she could in her power to make the world that was now falling apart become a better place. So all this to say, really, I think there's a lot more evidence to be found in regards to why she would want to live and keep living and keep fighting, live to see another day. There's way more evidence for that than there is for reasons why she should want to give up. The only real reason that I could think of why she'd just want to give up everything would be because, she didn't have Anakin anymore. And that is why it just feels so cheap and just very, like a very shallow end for such a good character. And so despite the fact that it is a canon fact that she lost the will to live, that is her cause of death on the official Star Wars website, I do not believe it. I accept it, but I don't believe it, if that makes sense. It's canon, so I have to accept it, but I don't like it. And so let's talk about theories, which are fan theories, as to what really happened. Because as I just explained, there's no way that the Padme we know and love, especially from episodes 1 and 2, would have gone out that way. There's just no way. So the most popular fan theory, and the one that I choose to accept for myself in my own headcanon, is that Palpatine drained her life force and transferred it to Vader so that he could save Vader. And there is a decent amount of evidence throughout Star Wars that does allow this theory to make sense. The big one is, of course, the legend of Darth Plagueis the Wise, which is what Palpatine tells to Anakin, essentially to get him to join the dark side, basically explaining that there was a Sith Lord, Darth Plagueis, who was known as, quote-unquote, the Wise because he was supposedly the master of death. According to Palpatine, when he's retelling this story to Anakin, Plagueis knew how to prevent others from dying, which is, of course, what gets Anakin intrigued, because the whole premise of Revenge of the Sith is that he's trying to save Padme from his nightmares where she dies. Palpatine also says that Plagueis passed on all of his knowledge of all of this stuff onto his apprentice before his apprentice then turned on him and killed him. And what we also know, not from this interaction, but what we do know, is that Palpatine was, in fact, the apprentice in this story. Plagueis was his master, and so it does make a lot of sense that if Plagueis was supposedly master of death, then he would know the dark force tactic of the force drain, which allows the user to extract the life force from another and transfer it into either themselves or somebody else. And so it does make a lot of sense that Palpatine would know how to use this. He would have learned it from his old master, Darth Plagueis. And we actually do see Palpatine use the Force Drain in The Rise of Skywalker against Rey and Ben Solo. Obviously, this is a lot later than Revenge of the Sith, but I do think that he probably did know this tactic already. Like I said, he learned it from Plagueis, so it makes a lot of sense that he would have already known it in Revenge of the Sith. The other big reason I personally think this theory makes a lot of sense is that when Vader wakes up from all of his surgeries, he asks, "Where's Padme?" and Palpatine responds, "It seems as though in your anger you killed her." And this is interesting because there's really no way that Palpatine should know that she's dead unless he had something to do with it. And so I think that makes a lot of sense as well. So this is a theory that I think makes the most sense personally. I don't think Padme just gave up the will to live, and this explains that, she didn't really have a choice. She was drained of her life force. Another theory that some fans believe in is quite similar to this one, except that instead of Palpatine draining her life force, it was actually Vader. And the way this theory goes is that Vader and Padme, or Anakin and Padme, are connected through their love, through the Force, and in his dying moments on Mustafar, Anakin reached out through the Force to that one thing that he always would turn to, in times of trouble or trauma. And whether it was conscious or subconscious, he basically stole her life force by reaching out to her. And it does make sense that he would be able to do this because we see in an episode of the Clone Wars, he actually uses the Force drain to save his Padawan. So he's done it before, so he must know how to do it. And even if it was subconscious, well, his subconscious could take over. And so this does make sense. I don't like this theory as much just because I'm not sure where I stand on the whole they were connected through the Force thing. That's definitely something I do want to dive into potentially in future episodes on their relationship specifically. But that's the main hang up for me personally. But if this is a theory that you want to believe, I think that's fantastic. I think any theory we want to believe that isn't she just gave up is a good theory to believe. So there's that one as well. And the last theory I want to mention is definitely not as popular, but I have seen it on some blogs and TikToks, etc. And that's that Padme faked her own death. And the way that this theory goes as well, we've seen her use decoys. Okay, so that makes sense. And it makes sense that she would want to be laying the groundwork for the rebellion and being part of that, but Vader couldn't know and Palpatine couldn't know that she was alive because that would screw everything up. And so that part makes sense. And then another thing that kind of lines up is the fact that in Return of the Jedi, we hear Leia mention that she's seen her mother when she was very young, and Luke's like, okay, that's cool. Like, I haven't seen my mom. And this even makes sense because Padme was at least good coworkers with Bail Organa, so it does make sense that he would allow her to potentially not interact with Leia, but see her in some capacity when she was quite young, potentially. And then on the other hand, it makes sense that Owen Lars wouldn't let Padme see Luke. So that all adds up and that all makes sense. The main issue I really have here is that kind of from Order 66 on, everything sort of happened so fast. And first of all, Padme was quite clueless throughout the entirety of Revenge of the Sith. And so I don't think that she would have had enough time for herself to be in the know to, plan this elaborate faking of her death. And I also don't think that, like I said, Order 66 happened really fast and kind of caught a lot of the Jedi off guard and also killed most of them. So I don't think that they could have been a part of this plan to help her either. That's the main thing I just feel like couldn't have happened. But again, if this is a theory you want to believe, I once again think that's fantastic. These are all just fun theories that hopefully make Padme's death a little bit better. And so yeah, whatever theory you do choose to believe, if it's a different one, that's great too. Like I said, the Palpatine stealing her life force is the one I think is the best, but all are valid. At the end of the day, though, these are all just theories, unfortunately, and the canon cause of death is lost the will to live. And I just want to talk briefly here about why I think that is very disappointing, and why actually Padme's character in Revenge of the Sith itself, like leading up to her death, is disappointing. First of all, I think there's a very important distinction that needs to be made when we're talking about female characters in film. There is a big difference between a character who is a strong female character, and these are the ones that, have that very forced feel about them, and it's like they focus so hard on just making her a strong woman, and it just doesn't feel natural. And then there's strong characters who happen to be female, and these are the characters that are just cool and like I said, they just happen to be female. They're not cool or strong because they're female, they just are great characters, and like I said, they happen to be female, and that is an important distinction. And Padme was, especially in episodes 1 and 2, one of these strong, independent characters who happens to be female. And I think that's what's most disappointing when we get to Revenge of the Sith, is they sort of take her from being this independent, good, courageous leader type character, and they relegate her to the role of damsel in distress. To me, at least, it almost feels like, George Lucas was writing this independent, cool character, and then he suddenly remembered that she was a girl, and then shoved her into that traditional female role that is in a lot of film. The doting on the man, oh no, how can I go on without my man stereotype. And in no way am I trying to condemn George Lucas for doing this, because I have no belief in me that he maliciously went out of his way to be like, haha, you're a weak woman, you can't survive with your man. No, I don't think that was a conscious decision. However, I do think it's important to have a conversation about the subconscious bias that is deeply ingrained in our society. It's getting better, but it's still prevalent, that women can't amount to anything without a man, and when you lose your man, how can you hope to go on? That is a subconscious bias, and I've felt it too, with my own internalized misogyny. And so I do think that it is an important conversation to have, and I think that's why it's most disappointing, because Padme really is a product of this society that we live in real life, and media is a reflection of reality. And so I think it's important to not gloss over this and not just to dismiss it, because it is important, and women can amount to more things with or without their man. So I do think that it's disappointing. And then, of course, the cherry on top is just, oh, my man's dead, I can't go on. That's just so lame. And women as a whole are much stronger than that. It's especially sad to me what they did with Padme's character when you find out that there was an original concept that she was going to be a lot more aware of what was going on in Revenge of the Sith. She wasn't just going to be sitting in a silk nightgown brushing her curly hair all day, and she was supposed to be in the know and actually laying the groundwork for the rebellion leading up to Anakin's turn, because she knew things were happening, and then ultimately in this concept she goes to Mustafar with a knife, to fully intending to stab Anakin in the back, both figuratively and literally. She in the concept, she doesn't go through with it, but it's just even that intention and her being assertive, that would have been so much better. The concept doesn't really explain how she ends up dying, but even just that alone would have made everything so much more satisfying. And so lastly here, I want to steer this kind of what if conversation towards potential causes of death that, in my opinion, would have been less lame. And the first is pretty obvious. It's childbirth. It was right there. It was right there for them to use, but they didn't. And the second cause is sort of something I touched on briefly right at the beginning. Had they made this into a mental health or trauma response type thing, I think that could have been really powerful. And I mean, I know mental health wasn't a really big thing back when Revenge of the Sith was released, but they could have been the pioneers for the mental health movement, and that would have been really powerful and really cool, especially to see something as serious as mental health portrayed in something as well loved as Star Wars. So I mean, I get why they didn't go that way, because once again, it wasn't a thing in society, but it would have been cool if that is the way they went. And then finally, the last way that I think she could have died that would have been very interesting and very dark is if Anakin had actually force choked her to death on Mustafar. I think that would have been very interesting, and it would have been interesting to kind of see more insight into his character in the aftermath of that, especially since he set out, the whole point of him turning to the dark side was to save her, and if he ended up killing her in that lapse in judgment, that would have been quite interesting. Once again, I say quite dark and tragic, but potentially very interesting, and feels like a lot more interesting and like a good ending than the way Padme did end up dying. And I mean, I guess additionally, any of the theories I mentioned previously, those could have been good ways for her to go as well. Anyway, that's all I really have for this particular episode. So if you are still here after 19-ish minutes of my ramblings, thank you so much. That means a lot to me. As always, please feel free to reach out to me on social media regarding the podcast or just Star Wars in general. I would love to hear from you. And I hope you have a fantastic day, night, evening, morning, whatever it is, wherever you are. And as always, may the Force be with you.